Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Robert Doerr, and I'm the Morgridge Fellow in Poverty Studies here at AEI, and have been for some time, although soon I will be the president of AEI when our great leader Arthur Brooks moves on to Harvard in July. This event was scheduled some time ago and something I really feel deeply and very intently about, and so I was not going to move on to the next job until we got this event done and this discussion of survey data, which is so important. The subject in front of us today may seem arcane or wonky, but the truth is that the question of whether survey data are still useful is a critical one. Here in Washington, it's fashionable to speak of evidence-based policy, outcome measurement, and other ways to make sure public policy is aligned and what we know works. That's good and worthwhile, and begins with how we gather the information that forms the base of knowledge used for making public policy. I should say I come to this from a personal perspective and experience because when I was the Commissioner of Social Services in New York State and New York City, I helped to administer programs that provided various forms of public assistance benefits to New Yorkers: Medicaid, food stamp benefits, cash assistance, child care assistance. And every year, the Census Bureau would report poverty data about New York City and New York State. And they would also allude to and discuss the supplemental poverty measure, which would discuss the ways in which various forms of public assistance can add to the income and resources of a family to make them be more strong financially, and in one way to raise their total resources above the poverty line. And every year, the administrators in our offices in New York City's Human Resources Administration and at the New York State Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance would look at this report and say, they're not getting it all. We've made all this work, we've made this effort in our job and consistent with federal and state policy to support and promote the use of certain benefit programs to raise incomes for struggling New Yorkers. And we would see a report from the federal government that attempted to say what was their financial situation, and it would underreport or underestimate the extent to which our programs were reducing poverty in New York and New York City. And that was a personal blow to us because our work had been underappreciated and underrecognized, but it also was a public policy blow because in looking at that data, policymakers and others may make decisions that lead us in one direction when the facts, reflected by what was really happening in these households, was something else entirely. So I've always felt strongly about this. That led to, in part, a partnership with Bruce Meyer, who was to be one of our panelists today, but he has been caught in the snow in Chicago and is not able to make it. And he has done very important work, which we're going to talk about concerning the underreporting of data in Census Bureau reports. But I'm now going to turn it over to my good friend and former colleague at Results for America, Ben Harris, who will take over the lectern in a moment to expand on why this topic is important from his perspective. And before he does, I want to emphasize how nice it is that we have panelists who are both skeptics and proponents of the use of survey data. Ben, Catherine, Ryan are all experts with unique perspectives on data collection and how our data should inform public policy. So it's great to have them all in our one room and on one panel, and have Bruce Meyer here in spirit at the very least. We are very grateful for the co-sponsorship of this event with Results for America, an organization that has been terrific to work with in finding areas of bipartisan consensus on data and evidence. This is just one step in our joint quest to turn better understanding of how Americans live into better public policies and better lives for all our fellow citizens. Now I will just briefly introduce Ben, who has joined us at AI for several events in the past, but has more on his resume that is worth noting. Ben is the chief economist and senior advisor at Results for America and the former chief economist and economic advisor to Vice President Joe Biden. Before we came in here earlier, I asked him directly whether Vice President Biden was running for president. He said, stay tuned. He is also a visiting associate professor at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management and was previously the policy director of the Hamilton Project, a fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution, and a deputy director of the Retirement Security Project at Brookings. Ben, take it away, and then we'll come back with our panel in a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be here at this event co-hosted by AEI and Results for America, discussing the critically important topic of survey data. Let me start with a few words of appreciation. I'd like to extend a warm thank you and also congratulations to incoming AEI President Robert Doar. Robert was a long-serving Results for America Senior Fellow and has been a true champion of data and evidence. It has been an honor and a pleasure working with him over the past several years. And I'd like to thank everyone at home, in the audience and listening at home, for being part of this event. If you're listening or if you're here in the audience today, I suspect you probably appreciate the importance of survey data, especially as a tool for evaluating whether or not government programs actually work. At Results for America, we see this data as critical to helping policymakers at all levels of government, state, federal, and local, make the best decisions and invest in the solutions that will have the greatest impact on improving the lives of people in their communities. Unfortunately, I suspect that many people see the topic of survey data as an esoteric issue, that questions of data quality and availability are topics best left to academics and statisticians and others who spend most of their time in the weeds of empirical study. Perhaps because so many see this as an issue best discussed in the basement of government agencies or university conference rooms, it seems clear that the role of survey data is greatly underappreciated. But I suspect that most people in this room know survey data underpins so much of what we understand about public policy and the economy. Certainly no one would argue that the unemployment rate is an esoteric topic, or retirement preparedness, or business confidence, or income inequality, or poverty or health insurance coverage, or household income. And yet, in the absence of survey data, we would have a much more limited understanding of these topics and so many others. When it comes to program evaluation, survey data continues to be paramount in our understanding of the impact of government programs. It is difficult to imagine, for example, how little we would know about so many public programs without the current population survey, the National Health Interview Survey, the Survey of Consumer Finances, and so many others. And more recently, researchers are just starting to grasp the magnificent power of linking survey data and administrative data in the same set. My hope is that today we can all stipulate the vital importance of quality, widely available survey data. And if we all agree that survey data is one of the most important tools to understanding our world, then we can use this time to discuss some of the most pressing challenges facing survey data more broadly. And to be sure, there are substantial and widespread challenges facing survey data. I'll lay out four. First, many policymakers remain unconvinced that the investment in survey data is worth the cost. I deeply worry that the profound importance of survey data to understanding programmatic impacts is lost on those making decisions. Results for America has long advocated for a 1% set aside for program evaluation, making the case that it's worth investing $1 to find out if the other $99 are being invested and being spent wisely. And underlying this call is the assumption that available and quality data are a necessary complement to this evaluation. We simply can't know if programs are working if we don't have the data. And oftentimes, it is survey data that we rely on. The recent shutdown at the end of last year and the beginning of this year highlighted how invisible data can be to policymakers. During the longest government shutdown in history, policymakers were rightly worried about government workers getting paid, public facilities being reopened, and public services, ranging from food safety inspections to airport security, staying on track. But it seemed, at least from the sidelines, that limited attention was being paid to what Pew calls the data casualties of a government shutdown, including everything from new home sales to BEA's estimate of fourth quarter GDP. My second concern is that the quality of survey data appears to be on the decline. As today's intended panelist, Bruce Meyer, and his co-authors argue convincingly in a 2015 article in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, survey data are in peril. They find that non-response rates have been rising for decades, while measurement error appears to be on the rise, leading to marked concerns about systematic bias in transfer program data. Meyer and his co-authors argue that bias has profound implications for our understanding of how government programs impact low-income families, and that this bias is likely not limited to transfer programs. Somewhat depressingly is that these challenges, ranging from respondent saturation with surveys to stigma over particular answers, have been around for years without a suitable solution, and many of the underlying problems appear to be getting worse. My third concern is that we have yet to fully appreciate the power of linking survey and administrative data. As Robert Doar and Linda Gibbs wrote in a 2017 Results for America paper, Linked data can allow researchers to glean remarkable insights that would have never been possible without using administrative data or survey data alone. And the promise of this approach has only strengthened with the increased use of administrative data. Raj Chetty, for example, found that the share of articles published in economics journals using administrative data rose from around 20% to 60% between 1980 and 2010. But linked survey data and administrative data is probably on the rise as well. To take one small sample example, a brief by Stefan Kahn found that in an average only one IZA working paper per year utilized linked data between 2001 and 2008, but that this grew to an average of 6 papers per year between 2009 and 2014. Still, linked administrative and survey data faces formidable obstacles, not the least of which is privacy concerns. Solving these challenges and making linked data commonplace is one of the most promising avenues towards better understanding of the efficacy of government programs. Fourth, and my last concern, is that there is not a clear understanding of how the rapid technological change that has given rise to big data and AI interacts with survey data. Admittedly, I have yet to fully wrap my head around this concern, but it does seem as though the forces that have propelled big data to the forefront of private sector innovation have largely escaped our approach to survey data. It seems, and this is just an impression, that we have become more adept about learning about people when they least expect it, but have gotten worse about learning people when they willingly share that information. The unfortunate byproduct is a cycle by which people become more guarded with this information, which only leads to private companies becoming even better at collecting data and people guarding their information even more closely. The end result could not only be the death of survey data, but also data which is voluntarily and consciously shared, leading to a blurred line between research and spying. Of course, it doesn't have to be this way. Technology should make collecting data easier, not harder, and it can potentially help protect privacy rather than destroy it. I'll conclude with this. I see enormous potential in the rise of evidence-based policy. It feels obvious, natural, and inevitable that the American public and policymakers across the country would like to know whether the trillions spent on government programs are achieving their desired objectives. It is encouraging to see progress that has been made over the past few months with the signing of the Bipartisan Foundations for Evidence-Based Policy Making Act earlier this year. Federal agencies will be designating chief evaluation officers and chief data officers and establishing learning agendas to help accelerate their generation and use of evidence and data. The new law also contains other key recommendations by the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking to help increase the secure access to data and to strengthen privacy protections. The bottom line is that there is no evidence-based policy without evidence, and there is no evidence without data. I firmly believe that survey data will always have a central place in academia and policymaking, but the degree to which depends critically on how we solve the very real challenges facing survey data today. Thank you for coming to this important event. I'll now turn it over to Robert. Robert, the floor is yours.
This is, the topic is survey data still worthwhile, still useful? And we have two great panelists who've thought about this issue for some time, and I'm going to briefly introduce them and also restate the challenge for our discussion, and then turn it over to Catherine, who's going to do a kind of double duty here, in that she's going to try to represent Bruce Meyer and also her own work at the same time. So, Catherine Abraham is a professor of economics and survey methodology at the University of Maryland. Her published research includes papers on the work and retirement decisions of older Americans, how government policies affect employers' choices concerning employment and hours over the business cycle, the effects of financial aid on the decision to attend college discrepancies in alternative measures of employment, wages, and hours, and the measurement of economic activity. She served as commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics from 1993 to 2001, and as a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors from 2011 and 2013. And Ryan Nunn is a fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution and policy director for the Hamilton Project. He was previously an economist in the Office of Economic Policy of the United States Department of Treasury, and at both Hamilton and at Treasury, he has conducted work on a variety of topics, including occupational licensing and non-compete policy. Dr. Nunn, thanks for being here. So, Catherine, I don't know if we made it, Ben, in our double efforts, made it clear what we're trying to really tackle as directly as possible here, but I want to say it as clearly as I can. For a long time, going back to the beginning of our republic, we called Americans up and asked them about their situation. And over time, we do more and more of that. And over time, it seems to us we've learned that we're not getting as clear and an accurate a picture of what's really going on in the households of Americans as we thought we had hoped we could expect. Is that true? And what should we do about it?
Well, I think there is a lot that we can learn from household surveys. But I think we've also discovered that there's a set of things that people just find it hard to tell us accurately about. It's when you ask people at the end of the year to tell us about their income over the prior calendar year, they find that hard. If you ask them to describe their work arrangements, they may find that hard. So there's some things we can really learn, and I don't think we're going to get away from needing surveys, but there's a set of things that it's become apparent it's hard for people to tell us about accurately.
Harder than it ever was before? It's gotten more hard.
I don't know if it's gotten harder or if people have become less willing to spend the time and energy to provide careful answers. The environment has changed. People, it used to be that if a government survey interviewer showed up at your house to talk to you about something, that was a rare and unusual event. Now people are getting calls all the time from people purporting to be doing surveys, even if they're really marketing efforts. And it's just, I think in the noise of all of this stuff, it's harder for people to sort out what's a really important thing and what's not, and maybe that's contributed to their being less willing to take the
Could
time.
it also be a diminishment in trust in American institutions, a sort of lack of faith in the government or whoever it is asking the questions?
I don't know that there's any evidence that would lead you to conclude that. I mean, it could be a contributing factor for sure.
So now, turning to your work, you've looked at the sort of the growth of the gig economy and the extent to which surveys don't accurately capture or don't appear to capture the extent to which people have different forms of employment than the traditional wage and salary. Am I right? Is that a fair
Right.
characterization?
That's right.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Maybe I can start by, my work in some sense builds on Bruce's work.
Okay.
And maybe if it's okay, I could just say a couple words about some of the work Bruce has been doing and then talk briefly about the work I've been doing.
Okay.
Because I think
that'd
they're
be great.
related. I think
That'd be
they're
great.
related.
And that's good. So let's
And
pull up Bruce's charts.
Do we have,
You want to hit the,
is this
there you go.
Okay. So, as I said, I think what we're seeing evidence of in the data that come from surveys is that, as I said, there's a set of things that people just find it hard to report on accurately. This is a slide from Bruce's work, and I really wish he was here to talk about it, but I want to get it in front of people. He's been doing, with a set of co-authors, work to look at how accurate are survey measures of people's participation in various federal and government benefit programs are. And what they've been doing is looking at what you get out of the survey data, and these are bars from a number of different surveys, and what you get out of administrative data on total spending on the same programs. What these bars are showing you is, in most cases, the shortfall in what you're measuring in terms of mean program dollars per person in the population from the survey compared to what the program data are showing. And I'm not going to go through this in detail, but in every one of these surveys that attempt to measure receipt of these benefits, the Survey of Income and Program Participation, the Current Population Survey, the American Community Survey, the Panel Study of Income Dynamics, the Consumer Expenditure Survey, what you're picking up in the survey is way below what we know we're spending on these programs, which is just telling us that these surveys are not doing a very good job.
Right. So a recipient of SNAP is saying to these various surveys that they're getting anywhere from, it looks like, 20% to 60%. Is that right way of reading it? Or?
Well, there's several different things going on. Part of what's going on is that the people who respond to the surveys may not be representative.
Right.
And part of it may be that they don't answer these individual questions. But a lot of it is, as you suggested, that they don't give you accurate answers about how much money they're getting. So
Because they can't remember, or they don't know, or they just lots of
Exactly.
factors going on. Yep.
Exactly. So I think that's an issue. So what would you do about it? You alluded to the, thinking about administrative data, and Bruce and the set of folks at the Census Bureau and other collaborators have a big project going on. One of the things you might do is, instead of relying on what people tell you in the survey about this, you might take the people in the survey and link them up to administrative data on what they're actually getting from these programs. And instead of constructing our estimates of income from their survey responses, construct our estimates of income from the presumably more accurate administrative data. And that could be tax data, it could be information on housing assistance, it could be information on Medicare participation, and so on.
And just from the perspective of a former administrator of these programs, we own the data at the state level, and we cherish it and nurture it and protect it, and we don't actually talk that much about it. We talk a little bit about it, but we're a couple levels down from the political leadership of the state. We're not the United States Census Bureau. When the United States Census Bureau says something is true, the credibility they have, because they're representing the entire country and they have a certain aura of independence and specialty, is greater than you would if you're sort of one state at a time, saying, well, no, wait a minute, actually, our ability to provide assistance to Americans is actually better than what the Census Bureau is saying. We're sort of overmatched. It's a little bit like being Jerry Quarry against Muhammad Ali, in a sort of a way.
Well, and I think clearly the Census Bureau would like to be producing data that are as accurate as possible. You did mention one issue there, which is a lot of these programs are run at the state level.
Yeah.
And it is, you think about the task for the Census Bureau of trying to assemble the data from all of these different states and pull them in to the, behind the firewall at the Census Bureau and put together these numbers. It's not that easy of a task, but maybe we can come back to that.
Right. And I should say the comprehensive income data set is an ongoing project that Bruce is leading in partnership with the Census Bureau.
Yes.
And I think with some participation of state agencies that are submitting data. And so there's hope here. Again, this brings back to sort of my attitude and sort of Results for America inspired attitude that little by little we can make changes that improve our country, and this is one of those examples. It's very important work. It's ongoing.
It's at an early stage, I would say.
Yes.
Yeah. But you asked about my work on
And Ryan, we're going to get to you.
trying to
Just
measure.
hang in there.
I'm pretending to be Bruce and me. That's why I'm taking so much time
so
here.
yes.
Just to very briefly to talk a little bit about some of my work, which has a similar flavor. I've been interested in the fact that although there's all kinds of media discussion about the growth in the gig economy and new ways of working, when you look at official survey data, you're just not seeing that. What this chart that I've put up shows is those lines in red down at the bottom are where this work should be showing up is in self-employment. So what those lines in red down at the bottom are a variety of different measures of the share of employment accounted for by self-employment. These are estimates from the Current Population Survey, from the American Community Survey. I'm not going to go into the details of how each of them is constructed, but you can see what they show, which is essentially a fairly low rate of self-employment that hasn't changed since the mid-1990s.
And yet we know.
But we think that
we think
things are changing. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that things are changing. One place that you could go, similar in spirit to what Bruce is doing, to try to figure out what's happening is you could go to administrative data. And what these series in black up at the top of the chart are showing you is a variety of measures of the share of people, employed people who have self-employment income from administrative sources, from tax data. It's the share of people who file a Schedule C, or it's the share of working people who file a detailed earnings report with self-employment income with the Social Security Administration, and they're telling us a really different story. Just to say one last thing about this, this is similar to what Bruce has been doing. We working with colleagues at the Census Bureau, I and several others have taken data from the current population survey, which is our big monthly household survey, and linked it up to tax data and looked at how well what individual people said about whether they had self-employment income over the prior year agreed with what showed up in their tax data and how that's changing over time. In this chart, the blue dotted line is the people who the reports agreed. The red line is the people who said they had in the CPS self-employment income, but you didn't see it in the tax data. We've always known there's some under the table work, which may be what that is. But then the really surprising group is the people who in the CPS said, no self-employment income for me. And then you look at their tax returns and they actually had self-employment income. So it's another example of problems with reporting, problems with picking things up in the household survey that seem to be getting worse over time.
And just from both of these series of charts, the administrative data, and this is a big global story, indicates greater income. As a general
yes.
rule, the administrative data shows that there's more income in households than there is in survey data.
In both of these cases, that
Right,
seems to be the case.
sometimes I relate that to sort of common American, underplaying. And of course, if someone they don't really know in a survey, they're going to say, "Oh, I'm not really making very much." It's kind of the old farmer, never admits how much, what they're getting for their milk. Anyway, that's a little farmer analogy, but it's true.
Being from Iowa, I would have said they're soybeans. But
Yes, right. No, so we've looked at a series of things that indicate a sort of discrepancy between survey data and administrative data or other sources of information about what's happening with Americans. So, Ryan, is there anything left to say positive about survey data?
I think there's a lot. I mean, I guess I approach this from a somewhat broader perspective here, in that because of all of these key advantages that we see in survey data over alternatives, I think that it's even all the more important to understand these limitations of survey data. But before getting back into the limitations of the survey data, I think it's important to really just remind ourselves of what the key advantages are in survey data. So I see at least three of them. The first is that survey data have, and in particular our federal statistical agencies' survey data, have this property that they're consistent over a very long period of time in many instances, which is incredibly valuable both for economic analysis and for policy evaluation. I think they have if you look at the CPS, you're going back through the 70s, the PSID, the NLSY, these are all examples. Obviously, the decennial census gives us an incredible perspective on how things have changed. The second key advantage that I see is the level of standardization and reliability that exists with survey data, and particularly with government survey data. So I think a lot of administrative data would require a tremendous amount of work to be made available for insights, whether in analysis or policy. A lot of times the administrative data are just not collected with an eye towards developing those policy insights. And so they haven't been made standard and they haven't been made available to researchers in the same way that survey data have. I think there's an incredible return to trying to get administrative data, to get big data to this place where they're useful for developing insights. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the Hamilton Project has a recent proposal by Justine Hastings at Brown on doing exactly this, sort of finding a way to create a data lake that would bring together a lot of these administrative data and make them useful for policy. But the premise of that proposal is that we're not really there yet in many instances. So that's the second advantage. And I think there's a third that actually gets less attention than it might. I think surveys and not administrative data allow you to ask about expectations, intentions that people have in hypothetical situations. And I think that matters in a lot of simple ways. We've talked a little about it. Ben mentioned the unemployment rate. It's obviously an incredibly important statistic for us to follow. Knowing from the CPS whether individuals are looking for work, knowing that some individuals who are working part-time are not able to find work, and therefore we classify as part-time for economic reasons. These kinds of questions really are hard to get at outside of a survey context. And they matter a great deal. So knowing the extent to which workers are underemployed is really important for the Federal Reserve, for Congress to be making appropriate policy to address the amount of slack that's in the economy. So, and then the last thing I would say is, I guess, I want to give you a concrete example of how some of these advantages play out in policy analysis. So I think one of the great insights that we've derived from survey data in the last several decades is with respect to the earned income tax credit. Okay, so what I'm showing you here in this figure is the labor force participation rate for 25 to 54-year-old women by different categories. So whether they're single and married, and whether they have children or don't have children. And you could do this, and I believe Bruce has done versions of this where he looks at the number of children. So you can see this separately for 0, 1, 2, and 3 children and more. But what you get out of this sort of simple figure is that in the early to mid 90s, there is a really dramatic increase in the labor force participation rate of women with children. And through a whole range of more careful economic analyses by a number of researchers, we've been able to link that with the earned income tax credit. And we've learned that the EITC has these really desirable employment promotion properties. That it targets the return to work, particularly for single women with children. It raises it pretty substantially, and you see that in the labor market data. So I guess I think this is an example of an insight that has been important for policymakers when they're evaluating add-ons to the EITC, as we saw for 3 or more children not too long ago, or indeed state EITCs. So I think.
So Ryan, I'm so glad you put that chart up. That's one of my favorite charts of all time. I use a similar chart all the time. I actually add in a little effective welfare reform policies that encouraged non-married single mothers to go to work in the same period as the 90s as the EITC increased. So that's absolutely correct. And this is totally derived from survey data.
This is from the current population survey, the March supplement to the CPS.
So what I want to know is, how would we know whether some source of administrative data would reflect an even greater increase in employment? And you're kind of raising the issue that maybe it was even higher, maybe it was even more.
Well, I guess what I would want to emphasize is that I think to even be able to look back through the 70s in a consistent way, using the same variables over time, it's hard to see being able to do that outside of the survey data context. And so having these long-running surveys is really valuable. But I certainly, and I wanted to talk a little more later about the ways that administrative data can be useful, particularly in conjunction with the survey data.
Yeah, the single with children, green line, 70 to over 80 is a remarkable change in American behavior in a time of welfare reform and the ITC expansion. That's correct. But now, you mentioned, I want to follow up on one thing you said about the weaknesses of administrative data. You indicated that, well, it's not as well developed, it's not as well mature, it's not been used for analytical purposes. And I just want to ask a little bit about that. So administrative data might be gathered in the context of an interview or a form submitted and signed with penalties for failing to answer questions correctly. It's entered for the purpose of calculating a benefit that's going to produce dollars out the door. It may even have an audit and verification requirement imposed by an oversight agency like the USDA. And it may have a alternative source of data, sort of compliance check. In contrast, the survey data, does it have the same levels of sort of care and gathering, or oversight, or review, or audit?
So I would say that I think the statistical agencies have learned a great deal over many years about what the best practices are in running these surveys and sort of how to minimize the kinds of biases we're talking about. But I certainly don't want to minimize the problems that we're talking about. And I think that Bruce's work and that of others has suggested to us that there are all sorts of ways we should be looking to benchmark these survey data with the administrative data for exactly the reasons that you just gave. I think it actually goes both ways, that administrative data are sometimes more useful when they can be benchmarked with survey data that's population representative.
Yes.
So I'm working on a project now on non-compete contracts where we have some proprietary data from a particular firm, and there's no way to make that representative of the U.S. population within that context of that data, and so we link that with surveys.
Catherine,
Just to pick up on this, I really want to echo some of the things you said, Ryan, about some of the challenges with using administrative data. It may be that they are relatively accurate, at least with respect to the things that the agency collecting them cares about. But there may be other things on the administrative data forms that aren't really used for anything in particular, and that information is likely not to be very reliable. Hopefully the income and the benefit receipt is reliable. A lot of these programs are run by states. That means that, as you mentioned, the way that the information is collected may not be standardized. That's a problem if you're trying to produce national statistics. The Census Bureau would have to pull all that information in and figure all of that out. Getting access is really difficult. I'm very excited about the comprehensive income data set project that Bruce and others are working on, but they're up to having data from, what's the current number of states? I'm looking at David Johnson. Yeah, so it's been very hard to actually pull this data in. At this point, getting data from every state requires negotiating a memorandum of understanding. It's very cumbersome. And then I want to raise another issue that I think as we go down this path, we're going to have to confront, which is how people are going to feel about privacy issues related to assembling all of this administrative data, even to be used for these statistical purposes. And so I'm very enthusiastic about the potential of going down this path, but it's not going to be that easy.
Yes, and I think it's one of the reasons it's not easy is because the direction from the Congress is not as clear, and it's not a requirement. And so, again, as a state administrator, I would have been uncertain and careful about sharing data with the Census Bureau. Now I did it, and because I knew how important it was, and I was willing to do it. But it is a state at a time requirement where you go and you ask and you negotiate and you persuade, and with state officials who are nervous about any kind of engagement with the federal government, it becomes kind of a one at a time, careful. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. If there was more clear direction, given in the case of SNAP that the feds pay 100% of the benefit and 50% of the admin costs, they have some responsibility. I worry that there's also a desire we don't want the world to know quite how much benefit we provide to Americans in these various benefit programs. But that's my
That's
own
a different issue.
That's a different issue. But the second
I'm
one
not
you
sure I'd
raised,
agree,
I
but-
do want to raise. It is true that there are lots of Americans, for good reasons, who are unsure about having this one central repository of data at the federal level. And you experienced that discussion at the Evidence-Based Policy Commission.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about what you faced and what you experienced in that discussion?
So, as you're noting, we really wrestled with this. One of the charge of the Evidence-Based Policy Commission was, among other things, to come up with a set of recommendations about how the administrative data that are collected in the context of running federal programs could be better used to generate evidence. So it was right on this point. And I think the going-in assumption was that the way to do that would be to develop a big repository where you just pulled all this information in and it would be sitting there. And then when somebody needed it to do evaluation, they could tap into the database. But as we started reading and talking to people, there actually was a proposal back in the mid-1960s to develop a data bank that would have done exactly that. And it was developed by a very distinguished committee of social scientists. When this word about this got out into the public domain, people were horrified. It never came to pass, and it actually was part of the impetus for the passage of the Privacy Act in 1972. So we didn't want to make that same mistake. So what we ended up recommending was a more an approach that really involved only bringing in data that were needed for a specific designated purpose, using the data to produce statistics. If the data were being used for evaluation, using them to do the evaluation, and then disassembling the linked up information as a way to try to address prospective concerns about privacy. One place that this has really played out in terms of legislation at the federal level to date concerns assembling student-level information on their educational outcomes.
Yes.
There's a bar at the federal level in assembling a student unit level record database, just exactly because of these concerns about privacy. And as the commission was doing its work, we actually heard from hundreds of people saying that they didn't want parents who didn't want their students' information assembled at the federal level. And that's one example. I think, depending on how you proceed, if you aren't careful, you could generate similar concerns in other areas.
And Ryan, where are you on this privacy issue? Are you sympathetic to those who are against the sharing of data, or are you feeling that it's much ado about nothing?
Well, I think it's somewhere in between there, and that I think there are things we can do to make use of data to generate insights that are incredibly important for making our programs more effective and for serving taxpayers as best we can. There are a couple things that occurred to me that I wanted to note that I think are implicit in, Catherine, what you were talking about, but that I just want to draw out for everyone. One is that in doing the kind of analysis we're talking about, you don't need personal identifiers, in the sense that you do need to link the data up in various ways, but then you shred the personal identifiers. So it's not necessary to kind of keep a permanent personal link. And the second thing to note is that this can and should, I think, also be done at the state level, where we're trying to assemble all the various data that states have and make it useful for refining those policies. And that may have different or lesser privacy concerns for some people.
So before I get back to the Evidence-Based Policy Commission, which I do want to talk about a little bit more about, I just want to, so we've talked about public assistance utilization, and we've surfaced a problem with the survey data, and that relates to the poverty measure using the supplemental measure. So we know that. But just on other statistics that we obsess about in the United States, we've alluded to a couple of them: labor force participation, wage changes, and unemployment rates. Just broadly speaking, how are we doing with regard to those? Are those as problematic as poverty and public assistance utilization?
I might start. I suspect you have more things to say on this, and so maybe I'll just start with a real quick one. Is that I think there's some recent work that's disturbing about the unemployment rate and the participation rate. I'm thinking of work by Ahn and Hamilton and a whole variety of others suggesting that we have different sorts of bias in measuring the unemployment rate. The rotation group bias, where people report higher unemployment rates early in the sample versus later in their time in the CPS, and that interacting with falling response rates. And Ahn and Hamilton conclude that we are underestimating both unemployment and participation quite substantially. So I would think that.
Wait. Underestimating, in other words, unemployment is higher than we think.
Yes.
And participation is also higher than we think.
That's their conclusion, and I don't know that this is a settled question. But
okay. What say you on that?
I'm not sure I think it's a settled question, but I mean, there's sort of there's a variety of things going on. You mentioned, Ryan, the importance of statistics that are comparable over time. If it's always been the case that there's a little noise in the data, but it's been consistent over time, then if what we're using the data for is to track how things are changing, I'm not sure how serious a problem that is.
Yes.
So, it's well established that the first time people respond to the CPS, they give different answers than the second, third, and fourth times. They're less likely to report being unemployed. They're less likely to report having more than one job. But if that's consistent over time, the measure is useful for tracking
Yes,
things.
right.
The thing that you worry about is if they're getting less willing to put the effort in to answer accurately.
And there is evidence that
and
it's
there is-
not consistent over time,
and there is
that it's gotten worse.
Yeah. I think it's a little less clear with respect to measuring unemployment and labor force, or at least it's a less settled conclusion. I think it's very clear when it comes to reporting on income, that the reporting has just gotten less good.
And just on that one, just to follow up, because I struggle with this, is we know it's income with regard to public assistance, but what about earnings?
So people actually do pretty well at reporting on their earnings. And I think the reason, if you think about the way that the data are collected, they're collected in February, March, April, around the time that people are doing their tax returns. They've just filled in the form showing their earnings. If they had a wage and salary job, they got W-2s. It's pretty easy for them to report that. It's these other things where they're not getting such clear information returns that they can look at where the reporting has gotten worse.
And again, worse as in underreporting versus overreporting.
That's what the evidence suggests.
Okay, Evidence-Based Policy Commission. There was you wrote the report, then you had as my memory is a whole series of recommendations, including recommendations on this issue.
Yeah.
You sort of skinnied it down for things that could get through Congress in the first go-around. It got through Congress.
Which is amazing. A commission that writes a report and then some of the recommendations get implemented. We were delighted.
And the president signed it.
And the president signed
At the
it.
last minute, as I understand it. So the question is where do we go from here? What's next? What do you want to do next? What should we be focused on?
Yeah, so the things that were in the legislation that was passed, there were a number of things, but the key things that Ben already alluded to briefly in his remarks, from my perspective, were the idea that departments should have learning agendas. They should have a chief evaluation officer who's responsible for trying to do things to address the questions in the learning agenda. And then something that Ben didn't mention, which is there's this provision in the legislation that says, unless there's a legal barrier, administrative data that the federal government holds should be available for evidence-building purposes, which includes statistical purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And from my point of view, that's huge. I understand you can't change culture with legislation, but you can sort of nudge
Mm-hmm.
people in a direction. And I think that's a big nudge in the direction of saying, our assumption is you're going to share this information that you have. You asked about next steps. That provision is great as far as it goes, but there's nothing in current law that says that SNAP administrators are expected to send individual level information on participation to the federal government. There are barriers in laws to who can see tax data even for statistical purposes. There's the barrier on assembling student level information at the federal level. And I think one thing that needs to happen if we're really going to make progress on this agenda of making better use of these other kinds of information is changing the laws that make that difficult.
Do you sense that there's a leadership role being played here by someone, either at Census Bureau or at Labor or wherever, that's trying to get the various agencies to work on this together?
Absolutely. I know that this is a priority for Nancy Potok, who's the chief statistician of the federal government. It's a huge priority for Ron Jarman, who's the acting director at the Census Bureau. The folks at the Bureau of Labor Statistics are very interested in this. So there's a lot of leadership at that level. There's also leaders in Congress who can, current and former members of Congress, including former Speaker Ryan, who cared deeply about this. I was stunned, I have to say, with everything that Speaker Ryan had on his plate, the extent to which he was personally involved in getting this legislation through and continues now that he's left government to be interested in this. So I think that's great. I think there's something else that has to happen, though. I mean, this isn't something that happens for free. You have to have resources in order to actually be able to do this. And so, I mean, the two things that I think need to happen are, one is to address some of these legislative barriers to making use of data for evidence-building purposes.
And cultural bases and institutional barriers. It's sometimes just fear.
All of that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I think making clear that this is something that leaders want to see people in agencies doing will help.
Right.
But there also have to be resources if we're going to actually pull this off.
Ryan, you have a comment on that?
I was thinking about something related as you're discussing this. One of the things that I think the statistical agencies have done in recent years that's been really valuable, that reflects their commitment to trying to provide high quality data that's useful for policy, is they've introduced new questions on really important policy topics. So two that are close to my heart where we've seen new questions being introduced are in the area of occupational licensing. And so we now have questions on that in the current population survey. We have questions in the SIP. And then on non-compete contracts, we have questions coming in the Wave 18 of the NLSY 97. So I think that I find it very heartening that the leaders there are sort of looking to improve the quality of these data, make them useful for policy. Having that kind of information is going to be incredibly useful for both state and federal policymakers at some point.
I have one other data source I want to ask you. It's a little esoteric and maybe it's a surprise. But the National Directory of New Hires.
Yes.
Could you tell the crowd a little bit about what that is and how that could be a better resource or not? Am I right about that?
So it could be.
Yeah.
So one of the things that if you're thinking about using data for evaluation purposes that you're most interested in many cases is people's earnings. If you do an intervention that's intended to help poor families, you'd like to see whether that translates into their having higher earnings later. We have pretty good information on people's earnings from unemployment insurance records. In every state, people, they work for an employer, the employer files a report with the unemployment insurance agency on how much each of them earned. The federal government actually gets those data. It comes in to feed the National Directory of New Hires, but the statistical agencies aren't allowed to use the data. That's crazy. The data are brought in so that people who aren't paying child support can be tracked down and for some other narrow purposes, but they can't be used for statistical purposes. So as the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking was thinking about its recommendations, the single piece of information that we thought would be most important for statistical folks, evaluators to have access to is data on wages. And one way to do that would certainly be to give them access to the National Directory of New Hires.
And just to give you an illustration of that, in New York, we used because we had a local directory of new hires, we had to gather it as a local requirement. And what it is it's actual, every time someone gets a job, the employer has to report it in a way that it goes to a data set for purposes of tracking child support obligors. But we were able, because we had control of it at the local level, to use it to see the extent to which recipients and applicants for public assistance in other programs were getting jobs. Whether they got a job because we helped them or a program helped them or they just went out and got a job. And we saw more employment than we had gathered from any other data source. So that was an interesting fact to unearth. And a very underutilized resource, I think, at the national level.
And because of legal barriers to people tapping into it.
So, okay, anything else we want to make clear on survey data that we haven't said that we want to make sure we get out there? But I want to summarize. You're both agreeing that there are problems with the surveys. They've gotten a little bit worse over time, and they should be looked at with a little bit of skepticism. And then we also should find ways to supplement them with administrative data that make them more accurate. And people are working on that. Is all that true?
That seems like a pretty good summary to me.
Okay.
I agree.
All right. No agreement on that. So let's open up for questions. Ben, did I get over all the things you wanted me to cover? You all right over there? Okay. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, David. You can wait for the microphone. That'd be good.
So I'm David Johnson, University of Michigan. So I want to push on this idea of how you use both together. So my question is sort of what is truth? So we know there's an issue with the survey data. We see increased underreporting, but when the short to Catherine said to be clarified, most of the reason that the dollars are less are because people aren't reporting they get the program, not that the people are reporting bad dollars.
Right.
And I don't understand why that's happening. I mean, stigma for food stamps has gone down over time. It should have, because with the cards and everything. And if you replace earnings data with the survey response, you'll find poverty goes up because people are reporting higher earnings on the survey. So to me, that's what we need to know. We know classical measurement error, we're really good at that, but we don't have any idea on the systematic bias, on why people aren't reporting or why they're over-reporting. And I just don't know if you have ideas on how we can look at that to really, to me, I want to improve the survey. I don't even know how to improve the panel study of income dynamics because I don't know why these people are not reporting what we think they should be reporting. I just don't know if you have any insight in that.
I have something to say about that, but you go first.
No, you can.
So you linked two things that aren't really the same, and that is the stigma for applying for and receiving public assistance is gone way down. That is correct. Lots of reasons why, good and bad in my opinion, people are much more likely. So participation rate in SNAP is up in the 80%. Some categories of recipients, it's higher than even that. And that's one thing. And then what someone tells a survey questioner about their public assistance receipt, in my opinion, is a different thing. And it may just be that they perfectly fine receiving and getting the benefit and applying and dealing with the government agency, but they're not so happy about telling that to someone who calls them in the context of a federal government survey. And I can see that in the people that we served in New York City and New York State. They become related to and have some relationship with the public assistance providing agency. They don't really know these other people. And I wonder if they just aren't as willing to be upfront about that. There are other factors that might go in, but does that sound plausible?
I think that could be a contributing factor. I mean, I don't know why it would have gotten worse. I don't think we know the answer.
Well, the take-up rate went up dramatically. So you could be worse just because more and more people are getting the benefit, not that more, you know what I mean? If more people are receiving, it's not a rate.
If the same proportion,
You're right. Yeah, that's
if the
true.
same proportion are
Yes.
reporting, the proportional underreporting
Would be
shouldn't
the same,
have gotten
right.
worse. I don't think we know, but I could point to another couple of things that might be at work. One thing that might be at work in some cases is that these programs have gotten more complicated. When it all was a program that just had the same name, you was always the same thing. It was AFDC, and now it's a different thing in every state, and it may just be harder for people to ask the questions in a way that are picking up
Different receipt of
what
assistance.
we're asking about. So that could be a factor in some cases. But I also think it's just, in general, we're seeing that people are less willing to take the time and energy to give accurate responses to surveys. I mean, the statistical agencies see this in a whole variety of ways. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that they're unwilling, particularly unwilling to talk to the federal agency. It's just that they're in general unwilling to spend the time and energy on this sort of reporting task.
I would add, just if I could real quick, this is a bit of speculation, but I wonder to the extent some of these programs are increasingly serving a population that is moving in and out of benefits receipt. If you're experiencing a lot of changes in both employment, labor market status, and then also how much you're receiving and whether you're receiving benefits, you can imagine that being harder, less salient for those people and harder to report.
Yes, ma'am.
This may be an unfair question, but as someone who works on the evaluation side of this, it's getting harder and harder to do the surveys, right? It's more expensive. We're getting less money from the government. We know nobody answers their phone. They definitely don't answer a cell phone. It's harder to do in-person work. People don't want to answer the door. They don't want to let you into your communities. Web surveys are not really helpful. We don't have a database of email addresses. So I'm optimistic that you can tell us how, I think the bigger issue is getting people to do the surveys, not necessarily the data we're getting from the surveys. So how do we get people to do these surveys? The other thing, and I should say OMB doesn't want us to do incentives while also requiring at least an 80% response rate. So how do we do this?
Catherine?
So I don't know what kind of evaluation you're thinking about specifically. I think going forward in terms of a lot of evaluation, we're probably going to have to rely more on administrative data. If you think about, as I mentioned, programs that are intended to improve people's earnings. You could try to do a survey where you went out afterwards and tracked them all down and asked them to tell you about their earnings, but it's going to be a lot more efficient and probably a lot more accurate to use data on their earnings. And so I think part of the answer is giving evaluators more access to that information for that sort of purpose. I don't think we're going to do away with surveys. I think you need surveys as a benchmark. All the reasons that Ryan talked about as to why the advantages of surveys, but for filling in information, in between surveys or producing more detailed geographic information, I think we're going to have to be looking at combining administrative data with survey data and doing more modeled estimates. And business as usual, I think, is really, given all the difficulties you mentioned, not an option.
Yeah, I agree with that. I can't, relying only on survey to then be a public policy maker and then make decisions, to me is very risky because you just are missing so much. And as I tried to mention in my introduction, there were issues that we had to tackle under Mayor Bloomberg that if we had relied only on surveys, we would have made one decision, and when we looked at it combining administrative data, we made a different decision. Yes, sir. And Carl and I may call on.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. I'd like to follow up, excuse me, I'd like to follow up on a question you asked early on in this conversation, and that was about trust. And I was really surprised at Catherine's answer that there was no evidence that distrust in government was a factor in all of this. And the census is the biggest survey we've got coming up. And it's my understanding, because I'm going to be working to try to get people to fill out their census forms, that, for example, the citizenship question is a big deal for a lot of people. 16% of American homes have an illegal immigrant in them. That poses the problem of them filling out a survey on census. So I think trust has a lot to do with it. Can you expound upon that, or would you like to retract your first?
Yeah, I have to say, when I was answering Robert's earlier question, I was really not thinking about the 2020 census.
Yeah.
And I think that's a somewhat different kettle of fish. And I there is some reason to be worried that if that goes ahead with if the census goes ahead with the citizenship question on it, given the things that you're pointing to, that there will be an issue with people responding. And I think that also could have negative spillovers on some of the other surveys that the government does.
On these fundamental questions of quantitative questions about the numbers, and I had a question that I didn't ask was, does the private sector and other gatherers of information, are they using techniques to get to the same questions that we're sort of stuck in survey land and we're missing out on, or not?
No. So what a lot of the private surveys have moved towards is online surveys. And they can be either opt-in panels or so-called probability surveys. The response rates to those surveys are really low. Mm-hmm. Some of these big online probability panels are 5% response rate. And then they're reweighting the data to match the demographic characteristics of the population. For some things, that may work fine. For other things, I just don't believe the answers.
Well, I was actually not referring to more surveys. I was referring to, so for instance, in expenditures, consumer expenditures.
Okay, so
You ask people what you spent, or you go to the stores and find out what they spent.
Isn't a problem with that, though, sometimes that if you only have access to a particular firm or set of firms' data, you're not going to have a comprehensive assessment of this. So often you need to be able to look to the consumer or the worker to get the full picture.
So despite they're still limited by an inability to see the bigger picture.
I should say that the statistical agencies are really interested in trying to figure out how to use some of that private sector data too.
Yeah,
We
I
weren't
bet
really
they
talking
are.
about that. I helped to organize a conference last month that was on big data for 21st century economic statistics, and using the scanner data, using credit card data, using all of these kinds of information. I think what everyone who was at that conference said, though, as they were talking about all this exciting work that they were doing, was we still consider the survey data, the estimates produced currently by the statistical agencies to be the gold standard, and we see the value of these data as being to interpolate, to provide estimates more quickly, to provide estimates that are geographically disaggregated.
Okay. We have one last question here, and then we will close it out.
Great, thank you. I had one question about the undercount that you were seeing with self-employed people identifying as self-employed, and wondered if the reason was that they don't consider themselves to be self-employed. Speaking as a 1099 person,
Yeah.
there aren't that many people who consider. I don't consider myself self-employed. I sort of consider myself self-unemployed. But that's a different issue.
I think that's a lot of it. When we dug in a little on this, some of the people that we saw were people who had a wage and salary job in the CPS, but they were getting paid as a 1099 worker. Some of them were people who were students or retired and had some self-employment income, and they just didn't think of themselves as workers, was our interpretation. And then there were quite a few people who have a wage job, and then they do self-employment stuff on the side, and it just didn't occur to them, we think.
And then I had another question about the new hires data. I've worked mostly with the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Our outcomes are calculated by a person showing up on the unemployment data that's collected quarterly, I believe.
Yep.
And so you are employed, if you show up there, you're employed, and how much you make is in there as well, and that's what's used to evaluate those programs. Why would that not work? Why is the new hires data different from using that?
Because we could access it. That's the main reason.
That's the main thing.
And we could access it in a more timely fashion. So we could look at it on a monthly basis and see, we took all the applicants and recipients of assistance, matched them against the new hire data set to see if they were any matches, and we found out how many people appeared to have gotten a job during that period.
So why is WIOA able to access the quarterly UI reports?
Well, they may be able to access it, and it's also lagged, and they may have authority to do that, but we weren't WIOA, we were TANF.
Okay, thank you.
Last question, I just want to ask, because we've talked a lot about benefit program administrative data. Do we get all we can out of the tax department in terms of use of tax data for research purposes and evaluation purposes? Is there anything happening there that is something we should know about or be eager to see change?
At this point, access to tax data is very restricted. The Census Bureau can access tax data for the purpose of improving its statistics, but other statistical agencies generally don't have access to the information. Evaluators don't have access to the information. You can understand why it's very sensitive data. very sensitive information, but it would make sense if we can figure out how to do it in a very carefully controlled way to expand that access for these sorts of statistical and evaluation needs.
I could just add real quick that I think that, the Treasury economists who do work with that data are doing some really useful work on a variety of topics that's been pretty helpful lately.
I did understand from a Census Bureau official once that the relationship between Census Bureau and whoever is in charge of the EITC world at Treasury was not as positive as they'd like it to be, that they could have learned more if we could just break down some barriers there. Thank you all very much.